The leather boot crashed into the old man's ribs. He hit the diner floor hard, his coffee cup shattering into pieces that mixed with the spreading pool of black liquid. "Stay down, old-timer," snarled the biker, his skull tattoos gleaming under the fluorescent lights. This is what happens when you don't show respect. The small-town diner fell silent except for the hum of the ice machine and the distant rumble of Harley engines outside. 30 customers watched. No one moved. No one spoke. The waitress behind the counter gripped her order pad so tight her knuckles turned white. The old man slowly pushed himself up on his elbows. Blood trickled from his split lip. His worn flannel shirt was torn at the shoulder. At 72, Frank Morrison looked every bit the fragile retiree he appeared to be. Thin gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, hanging crooked on his nose, hands spotted with age. "I said stay down." The biker's name was Razor, according to the patch on his vest. He was 6'4", 250 pounds of muscle and ink. Behind him stood 3 more members of the Death's Head Motorcycle Club, their colors proudly displayed. Frank's quiet voice cut through the tension. "Son, you don't want to do this." Razor laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the diner walls. "Old man thinks he's tough. Boys, looks like Grandpa needs another lesson in respect." What had started this confrontation seemed so simple. Frank had been sitting alone at his usual corner booth, reading the morning paper and sipping parfait. It was his routine. Every Tuesday and Friday morning at exactly 7:30 a.m., he'd order black coffee and wheat toast, read the local news, and watch the small town wake up through the window. The Death's Head Motorcycle Club had been terrorizing small towns across 3 states for months. Their pattern was always the same: roll into a quiet community, cause enough trouble to establish dominance, then move on to their next target. Local police were often too few in number or too intimidated to take effective action. When the bikers roared into the parking lot, their engines deliberately loud and menacing, Frank had barely looked up from an article about the high school's upcoming homecoming game. But when they'd burst through the door, loud and aggressive, demanding the best table in the house, which happened to be occupied by a young mother and her twin toddlers, Frank had quietly folded his newspaper and stood up. The young mother, Jessica Chen, was visiting from the city with her 3-year-old twins, Emma and Ethan. She'd stopped for breakfast on her way to visit her parents, thinking the small-town diner would be a safe, quiet place for the children to eat. Now she was frozen with terror as 4 leather-clad giants loomed over her table. "Excuse me," Frank had said politely, his voice calm but carrying easily across the diner. "Maybe you could ask nicely. There are children here." Razor had turned slowly, his cold eyes taking in the old man's appearance. The threadbare flannel shirt, the worn jeans, the scuffed work boots. Easy prey. "Mind your own business, old-timer, before you get hurt." But Frank hadn't sat back down. Instead, he'd taken a step closer. "Son, I'm making this my business. These folks are just trying to have breakfast. Why don't you and your friends find another table?" That's when everything went wrong. The other 3 bikers had names that matched their appearances. Viper, thin and wiry with a serpent tattoo coiled around his neck, stood to Razor's left. Bone, massive and bald with skull rings on every finger, blocked the exit. The youngest was called Psycho, barely 25 but with eyes that had seen too much violence for his age. They'd done this dance dozens of times before. Intimidate the locals, establish dominance, take what they wanted. Small-town people were sheep. They'd back down, call the police if they were brave, but mostly they just hoped the bikers would leave them alone. But something felt different this time. The old man wasn't backing down. Worse, he wasn't showing fear. Now Razor cracked his knuckles, each pop like a small gunshot in the silent diner. Nobody tells the Death's Head what to do, especially not some broken-down fossil. Behind the counter, Martha Williams, the diner's owner for 37 years, watched with growing dread. She'd seen Frank Morrison come in twice a week for the past 15 years, always polite, always tipping well, always treating her staff with respect. She'd heard whispers about his past, about why he lived alone, about why sometimes he'd get a distant look in his eyes when military convoys passed through town on their way to the base 50 miles north. But she'd never seen him like this. There was something in his posture, something in the way he held himself that made her think of a coiled spring. Frank struggled to his feet, coffee dripping from his shirt. His movements were slow, deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried something that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. I spent 40 years being polite, son. 40 years keeping quiet. But some lines shouldn't be crossed. There was something in his eyes now. Something that made the smart patrons near the windows start quietly moving toward the exits. Something that made the young mother clutch her children closer. Something that made Martha Williams reach for the phone under the counter. In the back corner booth, Harold Kowalski, a 78-year-old retired mechanic, recognized what he was seeing. Harold had served in Korea, had seen that look before in the eyes of men who'd been pushed too far. He slowly stood up, his arthritis forgotten, and moved toward the counter where he might be useful if things went bad. 2 tables away, Linda Rodriguez, a visiting nurse who'd seen her share of violence in the emergency room, was already calculating distances to exits and thinking about first aid. Her medical bag was in her car, but she had basic supplies in her purse. The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone could feel that something terrible was about to happen, but no one knew quite what. Razor pulled out a switchblade, the steel catching the light. "Old man, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The diner door chimed as it opened. A woman in her 40s walked in, her business suit crisp despite the early hour. She took one look at the scene, the broken coffee cup, the bleeding old man, the biker with the knife, and her face went completely white. "Dad?" she whispered. Frank turned slightly, his eyes never leaving Razor. "Stay back, Sarah. These gentlemen were just leaving." But Sarah Morrison Hayes, district attorney for 3 counties, was already pulling her phone from her purse. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "This is DA Morrison Hayes. I need police units at Murphy's Diner immediately. Armed assault in progress." Sarah had been driving to work early, planning to stop by the diner where she knew her father would be having his usual breakfast. She'd wanted to discuss his upcoming birthday plans, maybe convince him to let her throw him a small party. She'd expected to find him reading the paper, probably complaining about the editorial page. She hadn't expected to walk into a nightmare. Growing up, Sarah had always known her father was different from other dads. While her friends' fathers talked about their jobs at the factory or the bank, Frank Morrison rarely spoke about his work. She knew he'd been in the army, knew he'd served overseas, but the details were always vague, always classified, always not something you need to worry about, sweetheart. As a child, she'd noticed things, the way he could move through the house without making a sound, how he always sat with his back to the wall in restaurants, the fact that he checked the locks on every door and window every night before bed, the nightmares that sometimes woke him, leaving him sitting on the edge of the bed, sweating and silent. Razor sneered, "Lady, hang up that phone or you'll be joining Grandpa on the floor." That's when Frank Morrison finally smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator who'd been pretending to be prey for far too long. "Son," he said quietly, "you just threatened my daughter." The change in Frank Morrison was immediate and terrifying. The stooped shoulders straightened. The hesitant movements became fluid and precise. The kindly grandfather's face became something carved from granite. In the space of a heartbeat, 72 years melted away, revealing the dangerous man he'd once been. Razor had seen tough guys before. Hell, he was a tough guy. He'd done time in 3 different prisons, had scars from knife fights and bullet wounds, but he'd never seen anything like the transformation happening in front of him. The old man was still old, still smaller, still bleeding from his split lip, but somehow he'd become the most dangerous person in the room. Something shifted in the air. The old man's posture changed, his shoulders squaring despite his age. The way he held himself, the way he moved. Suddenly he didn't look quite so fragile anymore. "Sarah," he said without taking his eyes off Razor, "remember what I told you about my time in the service?" "Dad, don't—" Sarah's voice cracked. She'd prosecuted enough dangerous men to recognize one when she saw him, but she'd never imagined seeing that deadly calm in her own father's eyes. "About how I couldn't talk about most of it? About the places I'd been, the things I'd seen?" Behind the counter, Martha Williams was frozen, the phone halfway to her ear. She'd seen bar fights, domestic disputes, all manner of small-town drama in her decades of running the diner. But this felt different. This felt like standing too close to a bomb that was about to explode. The other bikers were starting to sense it too. Viper's hand moved instinctively toward the knife on his belt. Bones shifted his weight, preparing for violence. Psycho's eyes darted toward the exit, calculating escape routes. But none of them moved. They couldn't. They were mesmerized by the transformation taking place in front of them, like watching a house cat reveal itself to be a tiger. Razor was getting nervous now, though he tried to hide it. Something about the old man's voice, the way he stood, was all wrong. This wasn't how scared old men were supposed to act. The diner door chimed again. This time, a young man in a police uniform entered. Officer Jake Martinez, barely 25, fresh from the academy. He took in the scene, his hand moving instinctively to his service weapon. But Frank's daughter held up her hand. "Jake, just wait, please." Officer Martinez had heard stories about Sarah's father. Everyone in town had heard pieces of the stories. Frank Morrison, the quiet old man who lived alone in the house on Maple Street, the man who never talked about his past, who kept to himself, who seemed to know things he shouldn't know about people who crossed him. There was the time when Bobby Hendricks, the town drunk, had been beating his wife. The police had been called 3 times, but somehow Bobby always managed to talk his way out of trouble. Then Frank Morrison had paid Bobby a visit. Nobody knew what was said, but Bobby had checked himself into rehab the next day and hadn't touched a drop since. Or the incident with the drug dealers who tried to set up shop near the elementary school. The DEA had been building a case for months, but then the dealers had suddenly packed up and left town overnight. Word was that Frank Morrison had been seen talking to their leader the day before they disappeared. People whispered about Frank Morrison. They whispered that he'd been special forces, that he'd done things overseas that couldn't be talked about, that he still had connections in places most people couldn't imagine. But they were just whispers, rumors, small-town gossip, until now. "You see, Razor," Frank said, and the biker's eyes widened slightly at hearing his name spoken aloud. "You made several mistakes today. First, you assumed I was helpless. Second, you threatened innocent people. Third, you pulled a weapon." Frank took a step forward. Despite his age, despite his smaller size, despite the blood on his face, Razor involuntarily took a step back. "But your biggest mistake," Frank continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "was doing it in my town, where people know who I am." The diner door opened again, and again, and again. Police Chief Robert Wade entered first, his face grim. Behind him came Detective Lisa Chen, Officer Rodriguez, Sergeant Peterson. Then came people who weren't in uniform. Mayor Thompson, Fire Chief Adams, Judge Harrison in his weekend clothes. But they weren't what made Razor's blood run cold. It was the other men who followed. Men in their 60s and 70s, some walking with canes, some bearing the scars of old wounds. Men whose eyes held the same deadly calm as Frank Morrison's. Men who moved with the careful precision of people who'd spent lifetimes in dangerous places. These weren't retired factory workers or bank managers. These were predators, old now, but still dangerous, drawn by some invisible signal that only they could hear. The first to enter was Tommy Restrepo, Frank's oldest friend, and the only man in town who knew the complete truth about Frank Morrison's past. Tommy had been there in Cambodia when Frank had earned his first Silver Star. He'd been there in Somalia when Frank had saved an entire squad from ambush. He'd been there in Afghanistan when Frank had done things that would never appear in any official report. Behind Tommy came the others. Carlos Mendez, former Navy SEAL who'd lost his left leg to an IED but could still put 3 bullets through a quarter at 50 yards. William Bull Patterson, ex-Marine sniper, who'd never missed a shot that mattered. James Chen, Jessica's father-in-law and former Army Ranger, who'd been upstairs when his daughter-in-law had called in tears, saying men were threatening his grandchildren. 7 old warriors all told, 7 men who'd answered Frank Morrison's unspoken call, who'd come not because they were asked, but because they were needed. "Frankie," said one of them, a gray-haired man with arms like tree trunks, "these boys giving you trouble?" Frank's smile grew wider. "Nothing I can't handle, Tommy, but I appreciate you coming." Tommy Restrepo, former Marine Force recon, stepped up beside his old friend. Behind him, 6 other members of what the locals called Frank's Coffee Club, retired Special Forces operators who met every Thursday morning at this very diner to drink coffee and remember the brothers they'd lost. You know, Frank said conversationally, I was just telling these gentlemen about my time in the service, how I couldn't really talk about it, how it was all classified. Razor's grip on the switchblade was slipping. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. See, boys, Frank continued, addressing the bikers, but speaking loud enough for the whole diner to hear. I spent 28 years in Army Special Forces, Delta Force to be specific, 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Cambodia. Officially, I was never in Cambodia. 4 deployments to Central America, 6 to the Middle East. The diner had gone so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Martha Williams found herself holding her breath. Harold Kowalski gripped the counter so tight his knuckles were white. Linda Rodriguez had her phone out, ready to call for ambulances because she was becoming increasingly certain they were going to be needed. The young mother with the twins was crying now, but not from fear. She was crying because she understood what was happening. Her grandfather had been like this, quiet, unassuming, until the moment he wasn't. He'd never talked about the war either, but sometimes she'd catch him staring into the distance with eyes that had seen too much. Now she was seeing those same eyes in Frank Morrison's face, and in the faces of the old men who'd filled the diner like ghosts made flesh. I've jumped out of perfectly good airplanes into hostile territory more times than I can count, Frank said, taking another step forward. Razor took another step back, bumping into Bone, who was looking increasingly nervous. I've crawled through jungles and deserts, through cities where every shadow could hide an enemy. I've had to make decisions in split seconds that determined whether good men lived or died. Psycho, the youngest of the bikers, was openly sweating now. He'd grown up hearing stories about Vietnam, about the kind of men who'd fought there. But those were just stories, ancient history. This was real, and it was happening right now. I've been shot, stabbed, poisoned, and left for dead, Frank continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone but somehow filling every corner of the diner. I've survived things that would break most men's minds, and I've done things, necessary things, that I carry with me every single day. The diner was completely silent now except for Frank's voice. For 40 years since I came home, I've tried to be a peaceful man. I raised my daughter. I worked as a high school shop teacher. I helped kids learn to use tools, taught them to build things instead of breaking them. I've tried to make up for the destruction I once caused. Officer Martinez found himself holding his breath. Everyone in the diner was holding their breath. But you, Frank said, his gray eyes fixed on Razor like laser sights. You walked into my place of peace. You threatened children. You put your hands on me. And then you threatened my daughter. Frank Morrison, 72 years old, moved faster than anyone in that diner thought possible. The switchblade was out of Razor's hand and clattering across the floor before the biker even realized what had happened. A split second later, Razor was face down on the linoleum, his arm twisted behind his back in a position that made him scream. The other 3 bikers started to move forward, but found themselves facing a wall of old men who'd stepped up behind Frank. Tommy Restrepo had produced a pistol from somewhere, legally carried, properly licensed, and held with the steady hands of a man who'd never missed when it mattered. Carlos Mendez balanced on his prosthetic leg, his cane held like a weapon, his eyes calculating angles and vulnerabilities. Bull Patterson stood perfectly still, but there was something in his posture that suggested explosive violence held in check by the thinnest of margins. Boys, Tommy said conversationally, I'd strongly suggest you keep your hands where we can see them. The bikers froze. They might have been tough, but they weren't stupid. They recognized the look in these old men's eyes. These weren't civilians to be intimidated. These were apex predators who'd grown old but not soft, dangerous men who'd found each other in this small town and formed their own pack. Viper, the thin biker with the serpent tattoo, slowly raised his hands. Look, old man, we don't want any trouble. Too late for that, Bull Patterson interrupted. His voice was quiet, but it carried the authority of a man who'd spent years giving orders that meant life or death. You brought trouble to our town. You threatened our people. Now you're going to face the consequences. Razor could barely speak through the pain in his shoulder. You, you can't. Who are you? Frank leaned down close to the biker's ear. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that only Razor could hear him. I'm the man your nightmares warned you about, son. I'm the monster that other monsters check under their beds for. I'm retired, not dead, and you just reminded me why I was very, very good at my job. He straightened up and nodded to Chief Wade. Bob, they're all yours. The arrest was swift and efficient. The Death's Head Motorcycle Club members didn't resist. They couldn't get out of that diner fast enough. As the police led them away in handcuffs, Razor kept looking back at Frank Morrison with something approaching terror in his eyes. Outside, the bikers' motorcycles were impounded as evidence. The Death's Head's reign of terror across 3 states was effectively over. Word would spread through the motorcycle club network. Frank Morrison's town was off limits. Some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. As the last police car pulled away, the diner slowly began to return to normal. But it would never be quite the same. Everyone there had witnessed something extraordinary. The moment when ordinary people had stood up to bullies and won. When justice had been served not by the system, but by individuals who refused to let evil triumph. The diner slowly returned to normal. The glass was swept up. Fresh coffee was poured. But the atmosphere had changed. There was a sense of community that hadn't been there before, a feeling that everyone in that room had shared something important. Harold Kowalski approached Frank's table, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Frank, I just wanted to say, I served in Korea, and I recognize what I saw in your eyes. Thank you for standing up for all of us. Frank looked up from his fresh cup of coffee, and he was just a kindly old man again. Harold, we all served. We all did our duty. Today was just a reminder that the joy never really ends. Linda Rodriguez, the visiting nurse, stopped by the table as well. Mr. Morrison, I've seen a lot of violence in the ER, but I've never seen anything like what happened here today. You could have seriously hurt those men, but you didn't. You used exactly the force necessary, nothing more. That takes real discipline. Frank nodded thoughtfully. Ma'am, violence should always be the last resort, but when it becomes necessary, it should be swift, decisive, and proportional. Those boys needed to be stopped, but they didn't need to be destroyed. The young mother with the twins, Jessica Chen, approached Frank's table hesitantly, her children clinging to her legs. Sir, she said, her voice still shaking, I just wanted to thank you for standing up for us, she gestured helplessly. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here. Frank looked down at the twins, Emma and Ethan, who were peeking out from behind their mother's legs with windowy-eyed, curious eyes. The fear was gone from their faces now, replaced by the natural resilience of children who trusted that the adults around them would keep them safe. Ma'am, he said gently, I have grandchildren about their age. Nobody should have to be afraid when they're just trying to enjoy breakfast with their babies. Little Emma stepped forward, still shy but drawn by something in Frank's kind eyes. Are you a superhero? She asked in the direct way that only 3-year-olds can manage. Frank smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn all morning. No, sweetheart, I'm just a grandpa who doesn't like bullies. My grandpa doesn't like bullies either, Ethan chimed in, stepping up beside his sister. But he's not as strong as you. Jessica Chen's eyes filled with tears again, but these were tears of gratitude. Her father-in-law, James Chen, was one of the old warriors who'd come to Frank's aid. She was beginning to understand that her children had been protected not by one hero, but by an entire community of them. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and returned to her booth where her twins were coloring quietly, unaware of how close they'd come to real danger. Sarah Morrison Hayes slid into the booth across from her father. Dad, are you okay? Do you need to go to the hospital? Frank touched his split lip gingerly. I'm fine, sweetheart. Takes more than a punk in leather to put me down. I've never seen you like that before, she said quietly. I mean, I knew you were in the military, but there's a lot you don't know, Sarah. A lot I hope you never have to know. Frank reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. I spent most of my life learning how to be dangerous. but I've spent even more time learning how to be gentle, how to choose when to be which. Officer Martinez approached their table, his face still pale from what he'd witnessed. Mr. Morrison, sir, I need to get your statement about what happened here. Frank nodded. Of course, Jake, but first let me ask you something. Do you think justice was served here today? The young officer looked confused. Sir? Those men came in here thinking they could intimidate and hurt innocent people because they were bigger and stronger and louder. They thought nobody would stop them. But they were wrong, weren't they? Yes, sir. They were very wrong. That's the thing about bullies, Jake. They count on people being too scared to stand up. They count on good folks just wanting to keep their heads down and stay out of trouble. But sometimes someone has to say no more. Frank stood up slowly, feeling every one of his 72 years in his joints. I'm too old to be getting into fights in diners, but I'm not too old to know right from wrong, and I'm definitely not too old to make sure the people I care about are safe. As he walked toward the door, the entire diner broke into spontaneous applause. The young mother was clapping through her tears. The waitress, who'd been frozen behind the counter, was wiping her eyes with her apron. Even the cook had come out of the kitchen to join in. Frank Morrison raised his hand in acknowledgement, but he didn't stop walking. He had work to do, a deck to finish building for his neighbor, groceries to pick up for the widow down the street, and a Thursday morning coffee meeting with his old friends to prepare for. Outside, Tommy Restrepo was waiting by Frank's old pickup truck. That was some impressive work in there, Frankie. Like old times. Frank shook his head. But in like old times, Tommy. This was better. This time, we were protecting innocent people in our own community. This time, it was simple. This time, it was right. As he drove home through the quiet streets of his small town, Frank Morrison reflected on the strange turns life could take. He'd spent decades learning to be a weapon, then decades more learning to be a teacher, a father, a grandfather, a neighbor. Today, for just a few minutes, he'd been both. The Death's Head Motorcycle Club members were processed and booked without incident. Word of what had happened at Murphy's Diner spread through the county like wildfire. By evening, it had reached the neighboring states. By the end of the week, it had become legend. Razor, whose real name was revealed to be Kevin Thompson, a 34-year-old from 2 states over, spent 6 months in county jail. He used the time to think about Frank Morrison's words, about the difference between being strong and being a bully, about what real strength looked like. When he was released, he did something that surprised everyone. So, he went back to Murphy's Diner. Frank Morrison was sitting in his usual booth, reading the paper, drinking coffee. Kevin Thompson walked up to the table and stood there for a long moment, his hands shaking. Sir, he said finally, I came to apologize and to ask, could you teach me how to be strong without hurting people? How to be a man instead of a monster? Frank Morrison looked up from his newspaper. He studied the young man's face for a long time, seeing something there that hadn't been present 6 months earlier, something that looked like hope. Sit down, son, Frank said quietly. Let's talk. And in that small-town diner over coffee and quiet conversation, an old warrior began the most important mission of his life, teaching a young man that true strength comes not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when not to. The story of what happened at Murphy's Diner became more than just local legend. It became a reminder that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry badges. Sometimes they're just quiet old men in flannel shirts, sipping coffee and reading the paper, waiting for their moment to stand up and say, no more. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the most harmless. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy, it's turning them into a friend. Frank Morrison finished his coffee, folded his newspaper, and prepared to go home to his quiet house on Maple Street. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between force and gentleness, between the man he'd been trained to be and the man he'd chosen to become. But today had been a good day. Today justice had been served, bullies had been stopped, and perhaps most importantly, a young man had been given a chance to change his life. In the end, that's what being a warrior really meant. Not just the ability to fight, but the wisdom to know what was worth fighting for.